Hello, and welcome to another CSC Aware interview. This year, we have been exploring what consent looks like in the context of the sex industry. In this episode, we will explore how sex buyers understand consent. To do that, we will focus on punter reviews. Punter review sites are essentially forums where sex buyers write opinions about their experiences with women in the sex industry. They rate women's physical appearance, sexual performance, and personality, among other things. But these are more than simple opinions. As we will hear, they reveal sex buyers' skewed and dangerous views of consent. Our guest today is Dr. Alessia Tranchese, Associate Professor in Language, Feminism, and Digital Media at the University of Portsmouth. She recently published a paper analyzing whether the descriptions contained in punter reviews meet the legal criteria of consent. Punter reviews are part of our wider review culture. But as we will hear in this interview, what would seem like simple comments in a forum in fact represent a culture that promotes and spreads negative and violent attitudes towards women. Thank you so much for coming along and sharing a bit about this newly published paper. It's really interesting because it is something that talks a lot about how misogyny and the concept of consent are at the forefront of discussions around the sex industry. And I think what's very interesting about your article is that focus on review culture, which is something that is very known and familiar to people nowadays. We all seek out reviews when we are making decisions around buying things. But I guess I wanted to start today's conversation by asking you, how did you come to start working on researching consent specifically in the sex industry?
The point about consent was kind of something that came out from the reviews themselves. So I was aware of the existence of online communities where sex buyers post reviews, and it was simply something that I had come across over the years while I was doing research on violence against women in the media. So I remembered thinking that these comments clearly expressed a sense of entitlement to women's bodies. And the men who wrote these comments talked about women's bodies as not deserving respect, only existing for their enjoyment. So they clearly talked about violence in these comments, but there was no remorse for the violence they had perpetrated. There was just resentment towards these women. So I was aware of these communities, and I thought it would be interesting to study them because while there was feminist attention on them, I hadn't seen a lot of academic interest on these reviews. There was some work from a few years ago, but there hadn't really been a systematic study of these reviews. And as I was studying them, the idea of consent came to me. I didn't set out to look specifically for consent and how it was framed in these reviews. It's something that I noticed as I was doing the analysis. I went back to the definition of consent in the UK, and I kind of noticed that this was routinely being breached in these comments.
It's so interesting because what happened is that these topics around punters reviews and consent came to you from pop culture, from discussions that were already out there, from conversations around gender-based violence. At times, I think when we discuss the sex industry, it can be like this idea that somebody goes and sets out to look at the faults of the sex industry, but in fact, they were very clearly evident to you. And of course, in your paper, you've done a lot of analysis of what these punter reviews say. But in terms of choosing which punter reviews to look at, what was that process of choosing, like where to get them from, and what are the sites where you can find them?
So interestingly, there is actually a wide range of platforms worldwide where sex buyers are allowed to post reviews. They vary in terms of what they can do. Some of these are websites where they can pay for the services. When I use the word services here and in my paper, it's always in inverted commas, as I am critiquing the idea that these are like normal services. So these are websites where men can buy a particular sexual service or they can review it. So some of them are just for review or for advertising. So they vary a little bit, but there are actually quite a few of these websites. Now, for my paper in particular, I have not revealed the name of the website for privacy reasons, but one of the things that I looked at when choosing which of these sites to use for my study was the terms and conditions in terms of the ability to obtain data without breaching said terms and conditions. But the point that I think is important is that to a certain extent, the platform that we choose for this type of studies is relatively irrelevant. One of the main reasons is that I have observed similar patterns across different websites. The comments that I have quoted in my paper are not unusual. It's representative of the general discourse on these websites, but also because as I was reading these men's comments, a lot of them made references to other websites, suggesting that they are active across different platforms. So often it's possible that we have the same sex buyers writing reviews across different platforms, maybe the same reviews, partly because the women advertise on different websites too. So sometimes I came across men who had intentionally written negative reviews about certain women across multiple platforms.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And the fact that it's multiple platforms and there's this very similar behavior around that review culture that, mimics reviews in other situations, like when people review a restaurant or an object, or that idea of making it a way to punish somebody or something for not being right. But here we're seeing that applied to women's bodies, to women's personality, their sexual performance. And I think one thing that to me was very curious is that review culture translated into the sex industry. And I think that tells us something around the attitudes of men towards women when we see that, reviews are used to focus on objects and here is applied to women. So how does this dynamic of reviews in the sex industry, what does it tell us about that misogyny inherent in the sex industry?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There are common patterns, there are similarities between these reviews, and we could call them mainstream reviews. These days, we are reviewing everything from food to makeup to hotels, and it's very much a staple of the gig economy. It's something that we should focus on as a problem, irrespective of the sex industry, because it has created an issue of precarity for workers who are already in vulnerable positions. So in this system where we are reviewing people or services, these reviews are also used to rank, monitor, and sometimes penalize workers because, for example, managers can use these reviews to penalize some workers or to promote other workers. And so they also create competition and exacerbate competition. Basically, these reviews put pressure on workers to maintain these high ratings. And therefore, it's inevitable that people will change their behavior, their appearance, their emotional responses to meet customer expectations. This is common in all reviews. However, when it comes to prostitution, there is something unique and something different about this particular context because it introduces a serious risk of sexual exploitation. So in my study, what I found is that reviews, and especially negative reviews, are very much about how well a woman complies with certain requests. It doesn't become just a way to dehumanize someone or to exploit someone, but it becomes a mechanism of sexual coercion, which is quite distinct from other industries. If we think about other jobs, a bad review can result, for example, in loss of client. It can have negative consequences for a worker. But in prostitution, it can lead to a woman being pressured to perform a sexual act that she does not want to do, just to avoid a negative rating. Now, in other jobs, obviously, sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape can happen, but they are not an inherent risk of the practice, as in the case of prostitution. So that means that there is a space to clearly understand something as abuse, harassment, assault in a way that is not true for prostitution, where the two are so closely intertwined that distinguishing them becomes very difficult. Even in other industries, for example, there's a lot of academic work on emotional labor, aesthetic labor that people, especially women, have to do when they work in the service industry. So even in those contexts, obviously, there can be violations of somebody's dignity. But in prostitution, the stakes are quite different. Because there is a financial transaction for sex, there is a high risk of obscuring sexual violence. Basically, the financial transaction obscures the line between the practice and the abuse, because the very point of prostitution is sexual access to somebody's body.
And one thing that you mentioned as well in your article that I think it's something that we can say universally is that reviews of any kind influence behavior. And just hearing you talk is quite interesting because you're talking about how women's behavior when they're selling sex is influenced by reviews. How are sex buyers' behaviors influenced by these reviews?
Reviews give sex buyers very much the power, and they are aware of the power that they have through these reviews. So sex buyers inherently feel a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, but the fact that they are aware that they can later rate these performances gives them an additional layer of power, basically. In prostitution, obviously, there's already a transaction that does not happen between equals. But with online reviews, sex buyers have an additional layer of power that they can use to punish women and also to obtain compliance later. I believe the aim of these reviews is very much to punish women who don't comply, but also to make sure that women in the future will comply more because of the fear of negative reviews. Because obviously people who write these reviews are aware that sex buyers are reading them, but also that women in prostitution are reading them. And if you read some of the comments written by women on other platforms where they talk about dangerous clients, and you can see that they have read those reviews. So there is clearly a connection there. These reviews are not just something that are sitting on the internet and nobody is doing anything with them. They clearly have an impact in real life or the offline life of women. The effect that these reviews have on sex buyers is very much of reinforcing their power over the women in prostitution.
Looking at the examples that you give in your research, because you did this amazing analysis of the words that are used, the amount of text that is given, what is being said in these reviews. And it's interesting when you talk about that power that sex buyers gain from having these reviews in terms of influencing how women most behave in the sexual encounters, because there is that risk that they will be given a bad review and that means potentially losing clients in the future. But I found so fascinating that dynamic of how positive versus negative reviews are used. And I think it's a little bit different from how it happens in other areas when reviewing. So you were mentioning examples of how the positive reviews tend to be very long. They will mention a lot of detail about what happened in the sexual encounter and how the man reviewing felt about it. Whereas when it came to negative reviews, they were quite short. They wouldn't give any detail about what the sexual acts were. They would just say nasty things about the women and complain about them. But when we think about reviews in other areas, it's usually like the negative reviews tend to be very long and the positive reviews sometimes go without any words. So it's almost like here is the reverse. Why do you think punters use reviews negative and positive in this particular way?
So you're right. That's something that surprised me because, like you say, normally when we write a positive review for something, if we even bother writing a positive review, we either don't write anything specific, we just give 5-star, or we write very good, and we don't really go into much detail. And actually, most people don't tend to write positive reviews if they don't have anything to say. Whereas in this context, positive reviews were actually a lot more common than negative reviews. So there is something going on there where I believe that the function of positive reviews was very much like sexual arousal. There was a sense that the men were writing these very detailed descriptions of what they had enjoyed, almost becoming a form of soft porn. So there were descriptions of women's bodies, there were descriptions of the sexual services, again, that they had enjoyed, or the premises, for example. And again, if we look at how women react to these very detailed reviews, they find them quite upsetting. A lot of women talking about, again, dangerous or risky clients on other platforms were writing about how they felt that it was upsetting them to read such detailed descriptions of their bodies, of the things that they had done. So this is something that punters are clearly doing for their own enjoyment. There is no real reason why they should give such detailed positive reviews. On the other hand, there were negative reviews were surprisingly vague. They weren't necessarily short, but there wasn't a clear pattern of what they enjoyed and what they didn't. So with positive reviews, there was a clear sense that they enjoyed stereotypical feminine features like youthfulness or slimness, or what they called a good nature or a good personality, a pleasant personality, which basically meant willingness to do what they were asked to do. But with negative reviews, there wasn't such a clear pattern. There were very vague expressions like a waste of time or a waste of money or a bad attitude. So they were basically not really giving specific reasons. And this was what led me to focus specifically on negative reviews, because I wanted to understand exactly what it was. And what I found is that basically a negative review was left specifically when a woman had refused to do something that they had asked for, or in some cases when she didn't look like she was expected to. So a lot of men claiming that these women were using false profiles, for example. So the difference between these negative and positive reviews speaks to the different function that they have. So the positive reviews have the function to generate sexual gratification for punters. So for themselves, for those who write them, but also for those who read them. Whereas negative reviews serve a punitive function. They are written to damage women's reputation, so retaliation against them. Sometimes the retaliation goes so far that they even write that they reported the women to their agencies or the pimps that they worked for, the brothel owners, really putting women at risk. And this shows again the lack of care that these men have for the women who they pay for sex with. So the negative reviews are a form of discipline. But I think that we should not see positive and negative reviews as two separate things. They are complementary. They should be seen as part of the same picture, because positive reviews tell women in prostitution what men like and what will get them a good review in the future, and therefore potentially leading to more attention and so making them more likely to comply to requests. Negative reviews tell women what will lead to a complaint. And so if they want to avoid a complaint, they should avoid doing certain things. So they use negative reviews, like I said, to both punish women, but also to ensure that more women in the future will think twice before refusing. And finally, I think that positive and negative reviews also serve another function, which is to build the community of sex buyers. Through the reading and writing of positive and negative reviews, the sex buyers who read and write them learn what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, both in terms of what is requested and what is refused. So, for example, there were a lot of cases in which negative reviews were given because a woman refused what the men described as basic sex act, like kissing or having oral sex without a condom, which obviously are acts that are dangerous in terms of sexually transmitted diseases. But also, even if they weren't dangerous, if we were speaking about true consent, then it shouldn't be an issue for a woman not wanting to perform them. And yet they were complaining because these were seen as like basic acts. And I think that part of why they think this comes from having read other reviews and basically sharing the same ideological beliefs about what they can ask for and what women shouldn't refuse.
One thing that to me is such an important point is what you said about this landscape, that is represented by both positive and negative, because we can use the word positive and might be like, oh, well, that's wonderful that women are getting mostly positive reviews. But when we look deeper into what these reviews are actually saying, to me, it reveals a world that is more looking at the traditional gender roles of women, because the positive reviews are not about women's pleasure. They're very much centering the men and their pleasure and what they want. And what you're saying is the negative reviews are used as a way to punish, to put women in their place, right? So
Yes,
it almost feels like they're giving us a very traditional view of the world, hidden behind this idea that it's women making decisions and choices about their bodies.
Yes, yeah, it's absolutely about that. It's very much about reinforcing the idea that women's role in society is to be sexual givers. And there's an interesting book by Kate Manne where she speaks about this, about the logic of misogyny. And it's very much this idea that women are human givers. And one of the things that they give is sex. And so negative reviews are very much about punishing women for not fulfilling their role, while also praising women for fulfilling that role. And those are both sides of the same coin, really, because we might tend to think that misogyny is just about hating women or hostile behaviors towards women. But misogyny is also very much about rewarding women who comply. And so this is very much clearly explained through these positive and negative reviews.
Yeah, very much. And I'm thinking now, if we look closer at the actual use of money in the sexual transactions, there's also that aspect of how men hold this double standard around money being paid. And I think you said it very eloquently. They resent women whenever it is revealed that, yeah, they're there for the money. That's why they're selling sex. But to them, that's a negative point. But at the same time, they like the idea that they can just pay to have sex, keeping the whole process of sexual relationships, which will require a more social aspect to it, a more consensual relationship impact. To you, what do you think this say about men's understandings of consent, but also the attitude about whether women should be caring about the money or not when there's a transaction can also impact women's ability to consent in paid encounters. Like you said, it can force them to accept things they were not ready to accept because there's the risk that they will be given a negative review. So can you tell us a bit more about that relationship between money and consent and men's attitudes around it?
Money was a very big concern in the reviews that I analyzed, and waste of money in particular appeared very frequently in negative reviews. It was a frequent complaint, but it's not very clear, what is a waste of money? What is it that wasted their money? And was it because it was too expensive, or what was the reason that made them use this phrase so frequently? So when we look deeper into the reviews, we see that this frustration wasn't about the service, for example, being expensive, but it was about not getting what they felt they had paid for, what they were entitled to. Now, in terms of the consequences of this for consent, this shouldn't be a problem if consent were possible in the sex industry. But these reviews clearly show that consent is not possible in the sex industry. In fact, the reviews themselves, I think we should take them as an issue, obviously, because they are part of this broader problematic review culture. But I think they're also a symptom of a broader problem, which is the sex industry per se, and the possibility of consent in the sex industry. Now, we talk about sometimes, whether this true consent. So to me, the idea that we even talk about the idea of true consent means that consent is not a watertight concept. And this very much speaks to the problem of very low conviction rates for rape. Clearly, we're doing something wrong by using consent. And the reviews help us understand why this is a problem. Part of this is because it's very much linked to the idea of choice. Now, in prostitution, the idea of choice is flawed because many of the women who enter prostitution do it for financial need. So at the very best, it's a decision that they have to make in light of lack of other alternatives. But when it comes to prostitution, using choice as the line that separates violence from non-violence is flawed, because people who enter this financial relationship out of financial vulnerability are in a position of disadvantage and submission to those who don't. And this is the very level of inequality that exists between men who pay for sex and the women who sell it. So that creates a huge inequality between the two that consent doesn't really account for. Consent puts both parties on the same level, and it takes coercion into account, but it's very difficult to trace coercion where, for example, there's a negative review, risk of a negative review, but women don't even talk about it because even talking about it might lead to a negative review. And therefore, they might not even voice their concerns. They might not even voice their fears, and they might just go along with things without voicing it. So legally, this would probably not even be an illegal act, but is this something that we want to accept, or have we accepted that basically the rules of consent are different when it comes to prostitution because of the financial transaction? So the financial transaction really is the key. But another thing that is really key here is the idea that women in prostitution are naturally promiscuous. So when it comes to sex with a woman in prostitution, the sex itself doesn't really have an inherent value. The men, the reason why they feel like they wasted their money is because if they get what they would call just sex, they don't feel like they have had complete satisfaction. They feel like the transaction has failed. It hasn't got them what they want. What men who buy for sex are paying for is not just a sexual act, but it is the ability to bypass consent. It is the ability to do what they want without having to pay any consequences. And this is because women in prostitution are seen as enjoying sex irrespective of the money. So that's something that they maybe would do anyway. So like selling sex is effortless for them. So for the sexual encounter to be worth it, there needs to be some added value, which might be sexual practices that they don't think women would agree to if they didn't pay. It can be anything, just whatever they want in the particular moment. It doesn't even have to be a particularly violent act. This really undermines the right of women to set boundaries. And it shows the clear double standard where men really value their money because they think that it entitles them to get women to do what they want, but also resent women if they feel that they do it just for the money. Because again, it's like in their mind is something they would do anyway. So if they're doing it just for the money, it's because they're greedy. And in fact, one of the common phrases that they use is con artists. They think that women are, just exploiting men.
Yeah. And actually, on that note, in terms of the phrases that you were able to identify that's repeated in some of these negative reviews, there was the idea that women have a bad attitude. That was one of the three that you highlight. And we're talking a lot about compliance and this wrong idea that women sell sex for the enjoyment of sex when in reality it's because of need. So when we think about this phrase that is just bad attitude, what does that tell us about men pushing women's boundaries in paid sexual encounters?
Yes, bad attitude was the other common phrase used in negative reviews, which again is very vague. It's not really telling us what is a bad attitude and what does it mean, a bad attitude in a sexual encounter. Because if it is a refusal, then that's not a bad attitude. It's just somebody's right to assert their sexual boundaries. So I wanted to look into more detail into this phrase. And when I looked at all the comments that contained this expression, it wasn't used to complain about how women refused to comply. For example, to say that they were rude when they were refused. No, it was to complain about the very refusal itself. So in many cases, women were criticized, for example, for refusing specific sexual acts or changing their minds about what they were willing to do or not responding enthusiastically to a buyer's request. And this is where actually I started to see the link to the definition of consent and how there was a clash here. Refusing these things should be considered like a normal thing. It's what we're trying to teach society to accept as normal, people's sexual boundaries. But what I found is that these are normally dismissed in sex buyers as a form of lack of professionalism. If we look at the definition of consent, for example, it says that it must be given freely and by choice. But in many comments that talked about bad attitude, what they were talking about was, for example, a woman being passive or unresponsive, sometimes women having very poor English, or sometimes being very young. Now, this should all be seen as red flags for potential trafficking, which would very clearly speak to the fact that these women were not there out of choice, breaching the first provision of consent. The other thing that I found in comments about bad attitude was that the women were being criticized for not having accepted to perform certain sexual acts. Now, on these platforms where women advertise their services, again, in inverted commas, sometimes there are bucket lists of the services that are offered. And this gives the impression that these women are always available to do anything. And this is very much in breach of the second provision of consent, which is that consent is to a specific act. So if I consent to, for example, having vaginal sex, I'm not consenting to having anal sex. But men resented women when they rejected their requests. And the other thing that they also resented women for, and they called a bad attitude, was when they said that these women had broken their promises, again in inverted commas. It suggests that they thought that if a woman had agreed to do something when they decided to meet up, that promise needed to be respected, which is again in breach of the third provision of consent, which is that consent can be withdrawn at any time. So the very idea that we agree in advance to a sexual act is against the idea of consent. And if prostitution were about respecting boundaries, then that would not be a problem. But I believe that these comments demonstrate how prostitution is not really about that. And actually, if we got to a point where prostitution became about respecting women's boundaries, then prostitution would probably become redundant. Because the very point, like I said earlier, of prostitution for these men seems to be able to pay to do whatever they want without having to accept limits or boundaries. So there's a complete clash between prostitution as a practice where men respect boundaries and what men who buy sex actually want to do.
Definitely, when looking at these reviews, we can see they reveal a very skewed sense of consent when it comes to being paid. Like you said, it almost tells men that, consent is something that can be bypassed if you pay, and that the rules of consent are different in prostitution, which they shouldn't be by law. By law, consent in general applies in the same way to two individuals.
Yes.
And on top of that, I think in the sex industry, there is this common idea that it's a consensual relationship between two equals. But as we have discussed, there's no such equality, and there's no such understanding of consent in the same terms. So already that's problematic. Going back to the very beginning of our conversations, reviews influence behavior. And these very dangerous messages that, consent can be bypassed if you pay, that selling sex is a service and prostitution is a service. And if you paid, then you have to expect to receive what they promised you at the start. There's no chance to change last minute because it's a service. Then it totally changes that idea of healthy relationships that society is trying to promote. But we're talking about an idea, an ideology, a way of thinking that is being expanded through these forums. So can you tell me your reflections around how these forums are quite similar to other ones, other digital spaces that we're seeing increasing around the internet, where men promote and encourage anti-feminist ideas, violence against women? I'm thinking specifically of incel groups that we know are very much promoting this idea of women as compliant and rewarded and punished depending on whether they comply or not with those traditional gender roles and ideas about sex. In your view, what are the shared characteristics between these punter review forums versus these other forums that are actively encouraging men to be violent against women?
One of the things I was actually interested in doing when I decided to look into buyers' reviews was to actually look at the similarities between them and other groups that are active online and groups of men who they are active online in the so-called manosphere. So these online groups, digital spaces where men overtly express misogynistic attitudes, because there's a tendency, especially in the mainstream press, but also sometimes in academic work and discourse, to separate extreme forms of violence from more mundane or everyday forms of misogyny. Although historically, obviously, we have talked for a long time about the continuum of violence. So I see these different practices as very much part of this continuum where we should not separate them, and separating them out actually is counterproductive because it almost absolves those practices that are seen as being less dangerous. So what I found is that these groups do have quite a lot in common, even if incels are, typically labeled as extreme or dangerous, whereas sex buyers are more, we could say, on the ambiguous or everyday, depending on, the views that people have on this. So I found that there are a lot of similarities between these groups in terms of their ideologies and beliefs, and particularly the sense of entitlement to women's bodies and sexual access to women that really connects these groups. Like I was saying earlier, I was referring to women being, human givers, and this is very much part of the expectation of both groups. The idea that women's role is to give men sex. And so men should not really deal with women's rejections. Now, incels react sometimes, as we know, with physical violence that we're all aware of, because obviously we have seen this in the news. But what sex buyers do happens much more behind closed doors. And unfortunately, the violence that women in prostitution are subject to is something that doesn't often make the news. But these reviews are a window into what happens. And we see that there is still this sense of entitlement. And when men feel that they have lost something to women, they feel a sense of resentment and they want to punish them. And this is common. This is what they have in common with incels. Obviously, the level of resentment is different, but not all incels, thankfully, go out and, kill women. So those are, again, the most extreme side of the group. I would say that definitely the sense of entitlement to women's bodies, the sense that when women refuse sex are imagined as withholding something that men believe they deserve. And in prostitution, this is exacerbated by the fact that men have paid for it. So I think there's a core belief that is shared between these groups, and that is that the men should not face women's sexual refusals. There is a fundamental disrespect for women's sexual boundaries, and both groups see women as simply a source of their own sexual gratification. And in prostitution in particular, there is resentment because when women refuse sex, women who are seen as inherently promiscuous, these refusals aren't even seen as sincere. So even in the face of women who clearly look like they're very young or they might have been trafficked, that sense of empathy for them is lost, because it seems that what men can see is just the fact that these women are exploiting them for money.
And I think as well as seeing no empathy for women that clearly are under constrained circumstances, and probably it's clear to the men that they are not there because they chose. But on the other hand, I think one thing that came out from your look at these reviews is that sense of solidarity between sex buyers and their reasons for sharing those reviews to build that almost community. Yet we normally tend to think about community as something positive, something nurturing in our society. But here we are seeing a community that is sharing a very toxic ideology that is affecting another group, which is women, creating this idea of solidarity and almost share views, skewed views about not just consent, but about women's role in society in general.
I think there was very much a sense that men who were writing these reviews did not want to present themselves as being bad guys. They were very much invested in presenting themselves as being the victims, which again is a very common narrative among incels. The sense that they are the victims of women, like women have the ability to choose to give sex and they just refuse it. And here in prostitution, men have even paid for something that should be a given. So these sex buyers really present themselves as the victims in this context, even when they've clearly pushed the boundaries. they don't even see it as pushing the boundaries. They see it as getting what they have paid for. And this is what creates the sense of solidarity in the group. The idea that all these men are almost in it together to try to find a woman who will not exploit them and avoid the con artists. They very much present themselves as wanting to warn other punters from paying for sex with a woman who they were not happy with. One of the consequences of this was to, like I said, to punish women and eventually to push other women to accept their requests in the future out of fear of being reviewed negatively. So the sense of solidarity to me appeared more like a pretense or a justification for something that they knew could be seen as lack of empathy, because they were writing things about women being, like I said, very young or feeling very like unresponsive, almost as if they were kind of like disconnected from their bodies. So in order to justify this, they really presented themselves as the victims in these encounters.
And I think to me, your work reveals the culture of misogyny in a really interesting way through the words, through the descriptions of attitudes, through the actual act of coming together as a group of men that can, show themselves as the victims and therefore justify their violent actions. And I think it's been really good to hear, but I feel like there's much more that probably needs to be explored in this area and uncovered. So are you planning to do any more work in this area? Is there any plans you have in the future to continue this work?
In terms of my work specifically related to this paper on sex buyers reviews, I would like to take this research outside of the academic bubble to do something to change the current system. We need to look at this problem more holistically as an issue of misogyny. I am trying to work with organizations and also members of parliament to make sure that this research reaches the people who need it the most, and to really look at this as a problem of misogyny where the responsibility of what happens shouldn't be with the women, because the consent framework puts the burden of responsibility onto women rather than on those who have the ability to choose not to buy sex but choose to anyway. So that's something that I'm working on kind of outside of academia to see whether something can be changed, and also about the platforms themselves that host these reviews. More broadly, but still linked to this idea of misogyny being the overarching problem, I am now working on pornography. The issues are related because a lot of the narratives that I found in the sex buyers reviews, but also in incel forums, are very much the same narratives that we find in mainstream pornography. The normalization of violence, the routine violation of boundaries as a normal practice, using women's promiscuity as a fetish. These are all themes that are common, but arguably on the spectrum of violence against women, pornography is even more on the mundane, everyday side than sex buyers. So it's even more difficult to see pornography as related to these issues. And so what I am working on now is trying to connect these different practices to kind of like move beyond the binary of extreme and non-extreme. And so I'm working on a project on violence in pornography and mainstream pornography, but I'm also interested in the role of technology in perpetuating this violence, because like I said, we should also look at the role of these platforms and their responsibilities in allowing these discourses to be normalized and be perpetuated. So I'm using technology and AI in particular to see whether we can use this technology to do something about this issue. And interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, given that we know that technology is also shaped by a misogynistic society, even AI has shown to have bias in this sector and having a definition of violence that does not match the definition that feminists would give of violence against women. So that's where I'm going next. But even if I'm moving to a different practice, the aim is still to kind of like put everything together, trying to show the similarities rather than the differences between all these practices and the role of technology.
Yeah, and of course, all of these issues are connected very closely in terms of misogyny, but also we know that tech has really fueled things like the sex industry. So we really look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to follow Alessia's work, you can find a link to her academic profile and LinkedIn account in the description of this podcast. You can also find a link to the research we have been discussing today. CSE Aware is a platform where frontline workers can increase their knowledge and skills around the needs of women involved in selling or exchanging sex. You can visit our website to continue learning through our articles, training, and events. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we look forward to the next one. Until then, take care.